Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of the 14th Amendment, the amendment that makes all the other ones count. Why would I say that? What does the 14th Amendment do? Why is it such a big deal? Those are questions we'll be looking at as we continue on in the video. But before we go much further, let's just give a little background about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, which was right after the Civil War had ended, and it was originally meant to protect the rights of recently freed slaves. And this is one example of sort of the interesting twists and turns of history that this amendment, which was in many ways kind of aimed at a particular group of people in a specific point in time, really has expanded its power and become even more relevant as we go into the modern day, and it's gone far beyond its original purpose. I think it's interesting to take a look at that. Well, how does it become so far reaching and powerful? Well, the majority of the cases heard by the Supreme Court involve the 14th Amendment. And so, of course, the 14th Amendment is going to have a lot of impact because of these Supreme Court cases. And knowing that the majority of the cases heard by the court involve the 14th leads us to the other important fact that many of the most famous Supreme Court cases, which have incredible impact, particularly with civil rights, involve the 14th Amendment. Some of those cases are listed to the right of your screen. We'll come back around to those in a little bit in the video, but just kind of know that this is a big amendment that has a lot of impact because it is so central to a lot of civil rights questions that we have as a country. So without further ado, well, what makes this amendment such a big deal then? Why is it so far ranging and powerful, and why do we need to know about it? Well, one reason is that it is, of course, the longest amendment. It has 5 sections. Don't worry, we're just looking at the first section. But the first section of the 14th Amendment has 3 main points that really give it an awful lot of power. The first main point we want to discuss is citizenship. The 14th Amendment defines who is a US citizen. The next main point we want to look at is the principle of due process. The 14th Amendment defines and the expectation for due process, and so we want to take a look at that. And last but not least, certainly not least, is the principle of equal protection of the law. And we want to take a look and see how this idea has really impacted our country, again, particularly with regard to civil rights. So let's take a look at the citizenship thing. Who was considered a US citizen? In the words of the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Great. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that anybody born in the United States is a citizen, and as well as anybody who goes through that process to become a US citizen. There's a series of steps to take. You have to take the citizenship test, but once you do that, you are sworn in as a US citizen. Again, this was meant back in 1868 to make it crystal clear to everybody that former slaves who had been born in the United States were indeed citizens. However, this part of the 14th Amendment still impacts us today, especially when we look at the issue of undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants, of course, are people who come into the country illegally. They are not citizens, and they are not, expecting citizenship protections. However, if people who are here illegally have a child while they are in the United States, those children are, by definition, in the 14th Amendment, citizens of the United States, and they have the rights and privileges of those citizens. And so then it muddies the waters a bit when parents might be getting deported, but then that also could put the rights of their children at risk. And so this is an issue we still wrestle with because of the way that citizenship was defined back in 1868. The second big principle established by the 14th Amendment is due process of law. Basically, this goes to how government should act when your rights might be restricted. Again, in the words of the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, let's break that into actually plain English. Here we go. The first section of the due process clause deals with the fact that no state can pass a law that reduces the rights of a citizen. So, an example of this would be that in the early 20th century, many states had on the book laws requiring that schools lead children in school written prayer before the school day started. And so, a teacher or administrator would make the children say a prayer with them, basically, as the school day started. And there was a group of parents in a case called Engel versus Vitale that said, the prayer that is, you know, said in school that my child has to say that doesn't reflect our religious beliefs, and we think this is a violation of our freedom of religion. And we think that these states have reduced our rights as citizens. And the Supreme Court agreed with them. And that's why we don't have a prayer that we all say together at the beginning of the school day. And that's why a teacher or a principal cannot make you say a prayer. Although, as you know, you are very free to pray on your own at school. That's an example of the 14th Amendment having an influence on how states can pass laws or maybe not pass laws to deal with your other civil rights. Also, this due process expectation is the government must be fair in court and treat all citizens equally before the law. So, your right to an attorney, your right to not to have to incriminate yourself, all of those expectations have to be adhered to by all the governments to make sure that if you are in court, you are treated fairly. Last but not certainly not least is the expectation and the principle of equal protection. How should the government secure individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution? Here again is the language of the 14th Amendment. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And that phrase, equal protection of the law, is incredibly, incredibly important, especially when we look at civil rights. What does it mean? It means the government must ensure that all citizens are given their full rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, regardless of race or sex or class or any other characteristic that makes them different from everybody else. So, for example, famous court cases, Brown versus the Board of Education, that basically challenged the idea of segregated schools. The court felt that did not help. Segregation was inherently unequal, and therefore it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Another famous court case was Loving versus Virginia, where some states had on their books laws prohibiting marriage between races. You couldn't have interracial marriage. The people in Loving versus Virginia took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Yeah, that's wrong. You don't have your full rights as citizen if you can't choose who you want to marry." And so they saw that as a violation of equal protection of the law, and struck down those state laws. And so, really, this equal protection phrase has an awful lot to do with how we look at the question of are people really getting their full equal rights, and what is the government's responsibility to make that happen? So, in summary, the 14th Amendment defines citizenship. It requires the government to treat all citizens equally and requires the government to ensure that all citizens have their full rights. And that is what makes it such an incredibly powerful and long reaching amendment. Thank you so much for listening.